Welcome to Deadly Days, Tales of Dark Fantasy. This is episode number 83, and it is from the second volume or issue of Cocaine Magazine, which I translated for Sidereal Press. Now, this particular story, Maka Land, is rather unique because apparently it is a real story. In other words, it really happened. It is by the author Eduard Weber from his experiences in Africa. And there's a note here from the editors of the magazine. Eduard Weber, former naval officer of the Helen Warman Line, farm owner in Cameroon, and later a professional elephant hunter, crossed the Belgian and French Congo for years, as well as Spanish Guinea, southern Ashanti, Nigeria, and a large number of other colonies in Africa. His portrayals have the advantage of being real experiences and therefore strike one with their immediacy and impressiveness. We will continue his stories, each of which is self-contained, in following issues of our review or magazine. So, on the one hand, it doesn't really read quite as exciting as a story, but on the other hand, when you think of it as something that really happened to somebody, it is pretty remarkable. Just a minute. Dog is playing with the toy around the chair. Okay. In the hinterland of Jaund, there are said to be large savage jungle tribes. So I decided to go into this region. I had arrived at the Jaund military station. The gentleman who had been there for years warned me against this journey to Maka because the area had not yet been explored and was completely unknown. In addition, the Maka people were cannibals. But I did not give up on my decision because I had enough rifles and also could rely on my people like the cook, the boy, and the porters. Shortly before leaving, I received a visit from a young German businessman named Karl Schultz. Actually, he wanted to go to Vakoko to buy rubber, but when he heard about my trip to Maka, he asked if he could join me. I made Schultz aware of the dangers and told him that I would not accept any responsibility for him. Captain Grossig, the station manager in Jaund, also advised Schultz not to go with me into this completely unknown territory. But since the young man was not to be deterred, I finally agreed. After Captain Grossig said goodbye, I arranged with Schultz to begin the march to the Jaund region that night. He left and came back to my camp with his porters at around 2 a.m. My bearers had already arranged their burdens, so we started shortly after Schultz's arrival. We both rode at the front and spoke very little to each other. Sometimes the clear sound of a talking drum, made from a hollow tree trunk, made its way to us from a remote village. Towards morning, we passed a forest teeming with monkeys. It seemed as if they had called a meeting. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, we searched for a resting place. We pitched our tents, cooked our food, and then slept until late in the afternoon. In the evening, we continued our march. In this way, 6 days passed without the slightest incident. On the seventh day, we came to the Maka's region. You could tell from the paths, which were very narrow and overgrown, that the government had little influence here. Schultz, who had always ridden next to me or immediately behind me, now rode in the midst of the porters. We rested from 4 in the morning to 8 in the evening and then continued along the barely visible path through the brush. The bushes became more and more dense, the path more and more impassable. Riding was no longer possible. We had not seen a single native, although we had been in the Maka region for 5 hours. From inquiries that I had previously made, I knew that to the right of our marching direction was the rather large Maka village, Takwa. As much as I had paid attention to the track, I was no longer able to find the slightest trace of a path branching off to the right. I was just wondering whether we should continue marching or camp when the bush split apart less than 4 meters from me, and a Yaound man stepped forward. But no sooner had he seen me than he disappeared again. My cook, who was walking behind me, called to him in the Yaound language, to not be afraid, but nevertheless he did not appear again. By now the porters had approached, and my cook told them that we had seen a Yaound man. My foreman, Bajong, who had worked with the Yaound for a long time on a plantation, knew them and their customs very well. Now he tried to call the Yaound man. He pulled out his knife, stuck the tip and a finger into his mouth, and gave a very strange whistle. We were amazed when the Yaound man immediately stepped out of the bushes and called out to me in the Hausa dialect, Alafia, Hatulia, greetings, sir. With the help of my foreman, I learned from the Yaound man that he came from the village of Takwa. He reported that the Makas had once again raided them to take possession of human flesh, and had also taken a girl that was his. He went on to say that tomorrow morning the medicine man would arrive to kill the victims according to a certain rite, that he himself had tried to get into the hut where the prisoners were 7 in number, but they were guarded so tightly that it was impossible to save them all by himself. Now he was on his way back to his village. There was no use getting help from there because of the great distance. I had Bajong ask him if he knew the area. When he answered in the affirmative, I had Bajong tell him to lead us to a safe place to camp, from which we could get to the village in good time the next day. After half an hour, a place had been found and the tents were pitched. As soon as I was alone with Schultz, he accused me of making arrangements without consulting him, which was something that he could not agree to. I replied that my arrangements were for me alone and that he could stay in the camp or march on ahead with his own bearers for the time being. Otherwise, he could go back to Yaound. After his display of cowardice, I felt sorry that I had agreed to take him along with me. I called my foreman and asked my porters to remove the rifles from the load and bring them to me. Most of my porters had served with the military and were consistently reliable. I looked through the rifles, gave each of my men 10 cartridges, and told them not to shoot without my giving them the command. Then I went to my tent for my evening bread and to get some rest. Since we traveled at night, Schultz and his bearers spent the entire night awake around the fire. At 5 o'clock, my cook came to wake me up. The porters had already put their packs together and had fastened the rifles to the loads in such a way that they could be released easily and quickly. Once more, Schultz tried to dissuade me. He said I was putting myself and him in danger just because of a few Negro women. But when he saw that my decision had been made, he retreated to his porters and marched after us with his people. Just outside the village, I tried to work on him to give him courage, but it was all in vain. The village was already in sight. The bamboo huts of the natives were to the left and right of a large, clean square, about 12 meters wide and 100 meters long. At the far end, opposite us, was the Palaver House, the courthouse. In front of it was a platform constructed out of clay. Around it stood about 250 to 300 Maka men and women. The chief and the medicine man stood on the platform itself. The medicine man was dressed in a fantastic feather coat and a dance mask. No one had noticed us. The medicine man seemed to deliver a speech. The victims, girls aged 12 to 18, were tied to his left and right. Suddenly, a couple of prancing steps, a few sung words, and before I could make a sound, his club whipped down, a thud, and one of the unfortunate victims fell dead. "Ki!" I cried out. "No." Everyone turned toward us, and an ugly murmur ran through the ranks of the Makas. Throwing a quick glance back, I saw my porters right behind me with their burdens still calmly on their heads. Schultz seemed to have come up and stood a meter behind me on the right. I called to my cook. "Tell the medicine man to release the girls." The Makas had scarcely heard my request when they broke out in angry screams. The medicine man raised his club menacingly, and some of the Makas disappeared into their huts and returned with swords and spears. The situation seemed dangerous. Gradually, the calls of the medicine man calmed them down again. He started his singing again. Apparently, he wanted to put it to a test of power between him and me, because in the eyes of his people, the medicine man is considered invulnerable, and he was calculating that I would shoot over his head with my first shot, and he also knew that I wouldn't have time for a second shot. The chief rose gracefully, took one of the trembling girls by the hand, and put her in front of the medicine man. The latter now stepped back a little and made the same salutation as with the first victim. I could not wait any longer because the singing that was to follow the speech, as I mentioned before, was too short to do anything. So I slowly lifted the rifle, and when he turned his mask-covered face toward me, I fired. He died as he collapsed. When the Makas saw their medicine man falling, they hurried off hastily, leaving the girls on the platform. When my porters had seen me take aim, they had put down their loads and taken up their rifles. But Schultz and his porters had disappeared. When my cook saw my eyes searching for them, he said curtly, "He run." He ran away. When the girls did not come, despite all our calls, I sent the Jaound man and 4 of my porters to them. We could not stay long. I knew that. I ordered the porters to take up their loads, and we retreated as quickly as possible. It was only later that the girls first understood that they had narrowly escaped death. The Jaound man, Bajong, and my cook spent nearly a half an hour trying to explain things to them so they could understand. Now their tears flowed constantly, and they chatted even more like children than usual. During our march back to Jaound, they came to me at least 10 times a day to thank me for saving them. Nothing was to be seen of Schultz. The Makas dared not follow us into the Jaound region. A day's march before the June station, we met with Bishop Piter, who greeted me with the words, "I shouldn't really shake your hand because yesterday you have been accused of trying to murder Schultz." But the old bishop's smile showed me that he understood. Immediately after my arrival in Yaoundé, I went to the station where I reported the incident. The result was that Captain Grossig energetically urged the governorate that a punitive expedition to Maka was finally at hand. I later heard that Schultz had not even stopped in Yaoundé, but had marched straight to the coast and immediately taken a ship back to Europe, but that during the trip had gone crazy and died shortly thereafter. I surrendered the girls to the military station from which they were then taken back to their families. That's the end of the story. And like I said at the beginning, the remarkable thing about this is that apparently it's a story of true events. And I try to think how I try to put myself in the author's place, and I'm just totally, it's hard to do. That's a crazy story in a crazy world, and that happened over 100 years ago when Africa was a lot different and the world was a lot different than it is today. Thank you, and until next week, goodbye.